Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace. This is episode 21 of the KMG show. Today is St. Patrick's Day, St. Patrick being the patron saint of my people. First off, I wanted to say that we learned yesterday that because of the Wu flu, that YouTube has resorted to the use of algorithms to censor its platform. And it has acknowledged that this will result in false positives. So I'm going to be as careful as I can, and I would advise you all to do the same. Now, I suppose in the past, Ireland was considered to be a happy, jolly place. That was its public reputation. But now, apparently, it's an exceedingly depressing place. There have been all of these memoirs, The Miserablest School of Irish Literature. I wrote a parody of that a few years ago, which I will share with you. A great tramping, barracking, bollocking man was our father oppression. His writ ran the length and breadth, the highways and the byways, the uphill and the down dale of County Tooralura. And to be sure, any of us boys at St. Misery Guts had only to whisper a hint of a glimmer of a fancy of what we all wanted to do to witty, pretty Kitty McMahon behind Finnegan's cowshed, when then, as sudden as the rains that fell from the shimmering slaty grey clouds above, he would appear before us, as tall and as terrible as old Finn McCool himself, stinking of the bacon sandwiches he stuffed in his suit in, of the Jamesons he swigged from a battered pewter flask, and of the lack of the deodorant he damned as a wicked Protestant innovation, the wrath of 1,000 dies iraes in his eyes, etc., etc. Well, here is something else on Irishry. It comes from the great Irish author Flann O'Brien, or Brian O'Nolan was his actual name. And it's called A Pint of Plain is Your Only Man. When things go wrong and will not come right, though you do the best you can, when life looks black as the hour of night, a pint of plain is your only man. When money's tight and hard to get and your horse has also ran, when all you have is a heap of debt, a pint of plain is your only man. When health is bad and your heart feels strange and your face is pale and wan, when doctors say you need a change, a pint of plain is your only man. When food is scarce and your larder bare and no rashers grease your pan, when hunger grows as your meals are rare, a pint of plain is your only man. In time of trouble and lousy strife, you still have got a darlant plan. You can still turn to a brighter life. A pint of plain is your only man. And a pint of plain being a pint of plain porter beer, which is not what I'm drinking to celebrate this feast day. I'm drinking dry sherry. You know, a funny thing has come over the Irish that, to put it bluntly, they have sold their birthright for a mess of EU pottage. Eamon De Valera, who was the greatest figure of Irish politics in the last century, he was either prime minister or president for decades. He made a speech, a short radio address to the nation in 1943, which is now much mocked by the sophisticated people who rule the Emerald Isle. It's called On Language and the Irish Nation, and I will read it to you. It is short, and so you can make your own decision on whether it is indeed risible or not. De Valera wrote, "The ideal Ireland that we would have, the Ireland that we dreamed of, would be the home of a people who valued material wealth only as a basis for right living, of a people who, satisfied with frugal comfort, devoted their leisure to the things of the spirit, a land whose countryside would be bright with cozy homesteads, whose fields and villages would be joyous with the sounds of industry, with the romping of sturdy children, the contest of athletic youths, and the laughter of happy maidens, whose firesides would be forums for the wisdom of serene old age. The home, in short, of a people living the life that God desires that men should live. When the tidings that make such an Ireland possible, St. Patrick came to our ancestors 1,500 years ago, promising happiness here, no less than happiness hereafter. It was in the pursuit of such an Ireland that later made our country worthy to be called the island of saints and scholars. It was the idea of such an Ireland, happy, vigorous, spiritual, that fired the imagination of our poets, that made successive generations of patriotic men give their lives to win religious and political liberty, and that will urge men in our own and future generations to die, if need be, so that these liberties may be preserved. 100 years ago, the young islanders, by holding up the vision of such an Ireland before the people, inspired and moved them spiritually, as our people had hardly been moved since the golden age of Irish civilization. 50 years later, the founders of the Gaelic League similarly inspired and moved the people of their day. So later did the leaders of the Irish Volunteers. We of this time, if we have the will and active enthusiasm, have the opportunity to inspire and move our generation in like manner. We can do so by keeping this thought of a noble future for our country constantly before our eyes, ever seeking an action to bring that future into being, and ever remembering that it is for our nation as a whole that future must be sought. Well, the Irish people turned against De Valera and his ideals. They decided that they had discovered the secret that many men in the Middle Ages had tried so hard to find, the secret of alchemy, the secret of turning lead into gold. Apparently every Irishman was going to be rich. And as a result, the countryside is blighted with many, many thousands of abandoned homes. And now, of course, the Irish, who fought a bloody war against Britain and then a bloody civil war, decided they were just fine with being dispossessed and their budget having to be approved by their masters in Berlin. But perhaps there will be brighter days for the Irish to come. You know, I was talking about what Dr. Bruce Charlton had to say about these extraordinary events in our lives today. And I was reminded of a passage from a book that is almost 100 years old by Wyndham Lewis called The Art of Being Ruled. He read, "The puritanical potentialities of science have never been forecast. If it evolves a body of organized rites and is established as a religion, hierarchically organized, things more than anything else will be done in the name of decency. The coarse fumes of tobacco and liquors, the consequent tainting of the breath and staining of white fingers and teeth, which is so offensive to many women, will be the first things attended to." And of course, it turns out that Wyndham Lewis was right about this, and now we all have to be locked into our homes because the experts have decided. Now, in a situation such as this, extraordinary things happen, but one twist of the coronavirus, of the Wu flu story that I didn't see coming, was that Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, the pretty wife of our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, would turn out to be patient zero of the coronavirus panic. It was reported a couple of weeks ago that she and her husband are in isolation because she has been found positive for the coronavirus. There has been no follow-up on whether her husband has it. One would think that it would come naturally, but no word to that effect. Here's a story from People magazine. Idris Elba and Sophie Trudeau posed for a photo together days before testing positive for coronavirus. I got tested because I had realized I got exposed to someone who had also tested positive, and that would be Sophie Gregoire Trudeau. Now we find out that the former Prime Minister of Australia, whose name is Julia Gillard, She is now in isolation and is being tested or has been tested for coronavirus because, again, her exposure to the Prime Minister's wife. Now, for over a week, we were told that Sophie Gregoire Trudeau was in Britain for a speaking engagement. And I thought, why do I keep saying this phrase, speaking engagement? Why don't they mention what the speaking engagement was? Well, it turns out that it was We Day. That's short for W-E. You ever heard of We Day? We Day is one of those things that apparently is a thing, but it impinges so little on my consciousness that about once a year I have to remind myself through Wikipedia what exactly it is. And according to Wiki, We Day is an annual series of stadium-sized youth empowerment events organized by We Charity, formerly known as Free the Children, a Canadian charity founded by brothers Mark and Craig Kielburger. Now, I should be very careful about what I say about these two brothers because people comment about them, and then there are lawsuits. We Day events host tens of thousands of students and celebrate the impact they have made on local and global issues. Students earn their tickets by participating in the We Schools program, a year-long service learning program run by We Charity. Each event features a lineup of social activist speakers and musical performances. Yes, big names have taken part. Al Gore, Elie Wiesel, Martin Luther King III, Kofi Annan, and not to forget, Demi Lovato, Selena Gomez, Lily Singh, Jennifer Hudson, and Nelly Furtado. Also, outstanding youth speakers have included social entrepreneur Madison Torrey, artist Aidan Lee, poet Lorna Rasmussen, Indigenous rights activist Shania Pruden, young philanthropist Ben Sabick, deafblind advocate Serenity Racy, high school student activist Taylor Chow, and suicide prevention advocate Bailey Dunbar. WE Charity does not charge an admission fee for school groups or individual students to attend We Days. To earn entry, schools must pledge to engage in one local and one international effort. So they have this big blowout, and they had one in Britain on March the 4th, where I'm looking at a picture of the Houses of Parliament in London. They were at the SSE Arena. World-renowned speakers, A-list performers. This is what I associate with social justice, the phrase A-list performers, because that sounds so disinterested, doesn't it? The aforementioned Idris Elba, Lewis Hamilton, many times Formula One driving champion, Jamie Oliver, celebrity chef, Leona Lewis, who I gather is a singer, Gwendolyn Christie, she was on Game of Thrones, wasn't she? And then a very sulky looking woman called L, just the letter L, Divine. Some guy in one of those Nirvana t-shirts with the X's for the eyes, one of those emo Nirvana shirts. Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, of course, Julian Gillard, the Feds, some sort of musical conglomeration, perhaps the Celebrity Marauders, Margaret Trudeau, who, of course, is the mother of Justin Trudeau, and who is famous for, being bonkers and embarrassing Pierre Trudeau gravely with the Rolling Stones at Studio 54 in New York, circa 1980. And a bunch of other people, and there's the Kielburger brothers. I've often talked in the past of what I call the surplus created by capitalism. That who are these people? What are they doing? What is the point of all this nonsense? And it struck me at the time that it was the surplus created by capitalism that led to all of this stuff. If capitalism didn't create a surplus, obviously no one would put together such an event or events worldwide. So who are the sponsors? Well, let's go down the roll of honor of woke capital. From Canada, the Royal Bank of Canada. Now, keep in mind that there are something like only 6 banks in Canada. So a bank in Canada is a bigger deal comparatively than it is in the United States. TELUS, which is a major media company, which is majority American owned. Bell Media, another major media company. Yes, highly vertical, all of these companies. Ford, the Keg Steakhouse. From the United States, Allstate, the insurance company. Microsoft, well, you know of them. Unilever, that's a company that makes everything, I guess. And from the United States, Barclays, formerly Barclays Bank, Virgin Atlantic, and Boots, which is a chemist or drugstore chain, as we would say here. And so that is why the Prime Minister's wife was in Britain, where she got infected. So we're all being told to be responsible and to stay home, not to be social. But there's a whole class of people like Sophie Trudeau, whose job it is apparently is to flitter around the world, being applauded for being better people than the rest of us. I suppose it's nice work if you can get it, as they say. Let's see what the chat has to say. Dan Ellison, please be patient as St. Kevin drives the snakes from Victoria. YT says, my cat once brought me a snake from outside and dropped it right next to me. It was the most frightening day of my life. Still in daily therapy from it. Remember years ago, my mother had cats, Siamese cats, and they were all named the same thing, Suki. Suki would pass on, and we would get another Suki. And I guess she was fond of my mother because she would leave presents for my mother. She would dig holes in the backyard and kill moles and deposit them on her bedroom pillow, which she found horrifying indeed, but which the rest of us found very amusing. Chris Alton says, has Kevin ever commented on Keith Woods? I don't know who Keith Woods is. Lily Singh, ha ha ha. Well, yeah, that was my reaction as well. Apparently, we've lost her. We've lost her to America. This mighty talent, Lily Singh. It's a shame. You know, they all leave us eventually. All of the great ones. Okay, so we've talked about We Day. Oh, and yes, here is an authoritative bulletin from China, Xinhua News. Racism is not the right tool to cover your own incompetence. So this is clearly referring to the Wu flu, coronavirus, the China virus, or sorry, COVID-19. That's what we have to call it. I think Michael Doherty was joking that they're going to be renaming this disease like every month until the end of time. So the accusations were from the beginning was that China dealt with this badly, that it refused to cooperate with the World Health Organization, that it refused to cooperate with America's CDC, that it lied about spread, it lied about numbers. I suppose people will be debating that for quite some time because we don't really get reliable news from China. But the line that they have taken is that to identify in any way this disease, which came from China, Wuhan, China specifically, as a Chinese disease, is racism. But this statement, racism is not the right tool to cover your own incompetence. Well, commies, read that sentence again. The message is exactly the opposite of what you think that it is. Remember, we heard this incredible story about them supposedly building a hospital from start to finish in 10 days. Can't be done. Can't be done. You can put up a shed. A hospital, no, hospitals need to be very carefully planned. You know, there's a lot of electronics and such like. involved. And okay, here's from Martian Orthodox. Here's that meme of these two reality star ladies, one of whom is blonde and one of whom is not. And of course, the blonde is hysterical with rage, and she is labeled coronavirus, and she is pointing at the dumbfounded cat who is seated before a plate of vegetables, and who, the legend has it, is Kung Flu. But they're really pushing this line. A story from the Daily Star: coronavirus war of words erupts as superpowers blame each other for COVID-19 bio weapon. While all the earliest confirmed cases of COVID-19 were recorded in Wuhan in China, the Chinese government is now challenging the belief that the coronavirus started there. Zhao Lijin, a spokesman from China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has raised a theory, a hypothesis actually, that the virus actually started in the UA and was brought to China by US Army competitors in the Military World Games. This is another event of which I'd never heard of. Apparently the 7th of these games were held in Wuhan City from the 15th to the 30th October 2009, the largest event of its type ever to be held in China, with nearly 10,000 athletes from over 100 countries competing in 27 sports. And I wonder how many future World Military Games there are going to be. I wonder how many future Summer and Winter Olympics are there going to be. The Pentagon sent 17 teams with more than 280 athletes and support staff. There is no suggestion that any of them have tested positive for COVID-19. Iran, where almost 15,000 people have contracted the virus and 853 have died, is also questioning the accepted origin of the disease. This is the country that shot down a civilian airliner and then lied about it for the longest time. So they're certainly reliable. The Iranians are describing it as a deliberate attack. State propaganda channel Press TV is pushing the theory that COVID-19 is an American-made bioweapon. Iranian commenters have also said that, or that, wait for it, Israeli scientists are using the epidemic as a smokescreen for a targeted attack on Iran. Iran's Press TV quoted former CIA counterterrorism specialist Philip Giraldi, yes, I know who he is, who wrote, several reports suggest there are components of the virus that are related to HIV that could not have occurred naturally. Yes, we are all epidemiologists now. Rachel Chernasky, writing for the Foreign Policy Research Institute, said, one narrative all three countries highlight is the notion that the United States is weaponizing the crisis for political gain and thus worsening its spread globally. The crisis for political gain and thus worsening it, they just repeated the sentence. That's not my fault. You know, these websites, they're churning out the copy. So very much copy, and editing has just disappeared. She added all three countries' state-sponsored media outlets also publish related social media content. She also pointed at a Twitter post from Russian propaganda channel RT, which asked, who isn't going to be surprised if it ever gets revealed that coronavirus is a bioweapon? That's not exactly blaming the Americans, though, is it? Yeah, I really don't think that the Chinese are going to get much sympathy for this. Although I suppose they got a lot of sympathy from NBC News, which was absolutely shocked that President Trump keeps using this term China virus. I mean, why would you call it the China virus just because it comes from China? You know, there's some people who argue that you should scrub your Twitter account clean when it reaches, I don't know, 100 messages or every 2 weeks or something. Perhaps David Frum should have taken this advice, because there he was on Twitter complaining, nobody calls it the Spanish flu anymore. Well, actually they do, whereupon it was discovered that a few months earlier he had indeed described it as the Spanish flu. And a story from the New York Times, which is definitely on top of this story. Can Russia use the coronavirus to sow discord among Americans? Matt Taibbi comments, it just never ends. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Let's see. Trump tweets about coronavirus using term China virus. Oh, dear. The CDC has warned against naming diseases after locations, saying that it stigmatizes residents. And as I'm well ahead on the curve on this one, I was pointing out weeks ago that it's not the disease that is the most deadly. It's the stigma. I mean, stigma can kill you, 100 different ways from Sunday. Trump gave an address Monday afternoon in which he said the country may be headed toward recession and urged social distancing. He later tweeted his confidence in and support for various sectors, while including the offensive remark: the United States will be powerfully supporting those industries like airlines and others that are particularly affected by the Chinese virus. We will stronger than ever before, ! He said. Many officials, including the head of the CDC, have criticized the phrase as inaccurate. How so? And potentially harmful, and purporting racist associations between the virus and those from China. The comments prompted massive backlash from many social media users, including New York Mayor Bill de Blasio, who's not very popular. Well, he hasn't been popular in New York for a very long time, after telling everyone to lock themselves up, or else he drove across town to ride a stationary bike at a gym and watch CNN. Bill de Blasio wrote, if you're looking for someone to pin this crisis on, try the guy who made up a phony Google website or promised testing kits that he still hasn't delivered. Our Asian American communities, people you serve, are already suffering. They don't need you fueling more bigotry. Again, it's the stigma. It is the stigma. Okay, so, so what's this, the situation report? The sit rep on the ground. Well, I live in a place called Vancouver Island, which is the 8th largest island in the world. It is 68% larger in size than the country of England. And there's about 800,000 people who live here. How many cases of the coronavirus do we have on Vancouver Island? 12. That's right, 10 plus 2. 12. Notwithstanding that, it is utter panic here. Utter panic. It's the strangest situation that the streets are almost deserted, and I live just off one of Victoria's major arteries. I'm walking down the street, and I notice that people will walk into the bicycle lane. They will walk into the highway to avoid passing me on the street. It may be because I have gray hair, but and everyone looks very, very furtive. No one looks at each other when they pass by each other in the street. There isn't, that doesn't happen all that often. Let's see, BC suspends all K-12 classes in the province. And I was saying a few days ago that people were complaining that they were not allowed to stay in their vehicles when they were on BC ferries going back and forth between the mainland and Vancouver Island. Well, now you can do that. That's the sort of thing that you want to do. A happier story: stranded dolphins rescued off Vancouver Island. Death toll from new coronavirus in Washington State hits 50. Now, keep in mind that Washington State is ground zero, particularly Kirkland, Seattle is ground zero, and they've reached 50 deaths. Oh, Vancouver Island doctor wants locations of COVID-19 patients made public for the reason that, they could be attacked or something? Or that you could set up some sort of app where you could maximize your distance from these people. The dentists have been asked to suspend all elective, non-elective dental services due to COVID-19. Justin Trudeau is talking about, or it is being talked about with regard to him, invoking the War Measures Act, which essentially is martial law for the entire country, which his father infamously did in October of 1970. 2 people were kidnapped. The whole country was put under martial law. Habeas corpus was suspended. Hundreds of people were sent to jail without trial, including journalists, in Pierre Trudeau's vain attempt to kill the nationalist movement in Quebec. And in fact, it backfired in a very big way. Vancouver Island libraries close until further notice. Feeling anxious about COVID? Stick with the facts, says a counselor. Well, I suppose facts are rather hard to come by these days. We were told that apparently President Trump's experts told him not to ban travel from China and other places because it wouldn't help. That's what their models said. Furthermore, we were told that Boris Johnson had come up with this mass herding plan for Britain, and then his experts told him, no, don't do that because it will kill 200,000 people. So the generations are at war because of this. Here's a story from the Globe and Mail yesterday from someone called Dakshana Bhaskaramurthy. In anticipation of an afternoon visit, Sasha Wilson sent her parents a text message Saturday morning. I hope you guys aren't going to the gym. Radio silence. When he arrived, Ms. Wilson's father let it slip that they had in fact been to the gym, then out to a restaurant with friends, then stopped to grab a bottle of wine en route to another friend's house. This is a story from the New York Times, which has been picked up by the Globe and Mail. Ms. Wilson, 33, was livid as she mentally tallied all the potential people potentially infected with the novel coronavirus. Why do they have to add this novel? You know, I mean, why is that necessary? I just find it amusing that there's about 5 different ways to describe this. I guess that's how, you know, it's like baseball players with more than one nickname. You know, it means that they're popular, that people are talking about them. Anyway, so Ms. Wilson, Sasha, Sasha's actually a men's name. It's a diminutive for Alexander, but never mind that. She'd been inundating her parents for days with links to articles and podcasts about the importance of social distancing, minimizing close contact with others to limit the spread of COVID-19, and was annoyed they weren't listening. Her mother, Miriam Amalales, 61, thought her daughter was being paranoid. They'd survived SARS, H1N1, and MERS. And now because of some new virus, she was supposed to halt the dinner parties, the church groups, the group workouts. It's tough for us. We're social, she said. It's kind of cramped our style. The pandemic has provided a new outlet for generational tensions, which can go in many directions. While university students disobeyed public health officials and their parents to partake in St. Patrick's Day festivities in Kingston on the weekend, for example, defiance has flowed the other way too. The older set, predominantly baby boomers, boo, who are healthier and more active than their parents were at the same age, can take offense as to what they see as infantilization from their children. But members of Generation X, Y, and Z worry that mantras such as 70 is the new 50 have given their parents a false sense of security. What's the generation going to be after Generation Z? Are they going to start with A again, or are they going to go in another direction? The fatality risk for COVID-19 is often reported as 2%, but that's for the overall population. And of course, it goes up the older you get. So you have young people, oh, yeah, their parents went on a cruise, and why anyone would want to go on a cruise is something of a mystery to me. But wait a minute. Apparently, it's coming from the other direction as well. This is a story from the Wall Street Journal from Bojan Pansevsky, Stacy Miketree, and Xavier Font de Gloria. Scientists and government officials fighting the coronavirus epic say they have a problem. Carefree youths. As authorities moved to restrict social gatherings last week, bars and restaurants from New York to Berlin filled up with revelers. Illegal lockdown parties popped up in France and Belgium, and campuses in the US lit up for end-of-the-world dorm parties. So far, most young COVID-19 patients have experienced mild or no symptoms from the virus, while more severe cases are concentrated among those aged 50 or older. Data released last week by the National Health Institute in Italy, currently the world's worst hit country, showed mortality rates starting at 0% for patients aged 0 to 29 and edging up to peak at 19% for those over 90. When you get to be over 90, losing your breath, exerting yourself to the point where you can't catch your breath, that's potentially life-threatening. Going to sit down on the couch and landing a little too hard, that is potentially life-threatening. Scientists say tests of some children and young adults are no less likely than older people to get infected and transmit the virus. Epidemiologists, and we all know one epidemiologist now, they are the most popular people alive now, are growing concerned that the millennial pushback against social distancing measures and an emerging generational divide about how the disease is perceived could undo all efforts, that is a bold statement, to slow the spread of the virus and put vulnerable people at high risk. President Trump on Monday stressed that young people can spread the virus even if they only have mild symptoms and recommended that Americans avoid restaurants and gatherings of more than 10 people. French President Emmanuel Macron went further, announcing a nationwide lockdown and punishment for those who violate the rules. I'm reminded that during the Blitz in Britain during World War II, you had instructions to turn off the lights, and you have older people that would from time to time forget, and there was a certain type of people who took great glee in dragging these people off to the police for their punishment. Let's see, what does Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have to say to everyone in New York City, but especially healthy people and people under 40, because from what I'm observing, that's who needs to hear this again. Please stop crowding bars, restaurants, and public spaces right now. Eat your meals at home. People were not ready to give up their lifestyle without one last hurrah, said Ben Weissenbach, a Princeton undergraduate English major who was critical of some of the partying. At a really privileged place like Princeton, we don't tend to even consider the possibility that our bubble could be popped. I don't really think that, whether you go to Princeton or whether you go to State makes much difference as far as that's concerned with young people. If you're 20 years old and you can expect to live another 60 years, then you're not going to be really worried all that much about things like the coronavirus, are you? So, yeah. Everyone's been told to stay home. Everyone's been told to avoid everyone. And the old people are blaming the young people. And the young people are blaming the old people. And bailouts. We're going to have bailouts. This is all working out so very well. So, is it acceptable to make jokes about coronavirus? Well, there's a satirical piece here from Nate Odenkirk, who I gather is a member of the Odenkirk comedy clan. He writes, officials from the World Health Organization shocked the world today by officially classifying coronavirus jokes as a pandemic. We arrived at this conclusion by looking at two factors, the rate at which these jokes spread and if the jokes themselves are funny or just really annoying, said Marcus Thiessen, a WHO representative. Unfortunately, these jokes have spread at a rate that we cannot contain and are mutating in such subtle ways that our scientists can't account for. One thing they all have in common, they all elicit only a polite chuckle, he said, at best. Their very first coronavirus joke began in early February, traced to an internet user who commented on a story about the then emerging disease. Looks like they could use a lime with that. Smiley face. It attracted little attention at the time, but that one stupid joke set off a chain reaction, culminating its appearance on late-night shows where millions of people were exposed to the jokes. Oh, yes, another one. For example, I have this one bit of how the coronavirus is like noodles. Both started in China and Italy, he said, apparently having finished the joke. Well, I guess this could be another great division between young people and old people. We know from innumerable stories that a great many young people find joking about anything really to be problematic at best and completely unacceptable at worst. So I talked about a sit-rep situation in my own country. This is tangentially related, but my country's in very, very serious trouble. A report from the Fraser Institute: Canada has massive investment potential. We have an abundance of natural resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not working that way. The blame lies at the feet of a current federal government, which recently created a new agency, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, to review major energy projects, injecting significant subjective criteria into project analyses, including social impact, gender implications, and potential climate effects, and further politicized the process by placing final decisions on approval or rejection in the hands of the federal cabinet. Justin Trudeau was worried, or he stated publicly a few months ago, that he was worried that construction projects, energy projects, that this was going to lead to rape because of, all of these men being hired for these jobs. So maybe we should just stop all of that sort of thing. The government has also created mass uncertainty with unsustainable federal budget deficits, tax increases on high-skilled workers and entrepreneurs, and more burdensome regulations. Specifically, there is no longer certainty of title in my country. According to Statistics Canada data, inflation-adjusted business investment in Canada has declined by 5.3% over the past 5 years. But crucially, if you remove residential structures and business investment in machinery and equipment from the equation, investment in intellectual property and non-residential structures has decreased by 13.2%. And this isn't just an oil and gas story. There's been a significant drop in investment across 10 of the 15 major sectors of the Canadian economy, including agriculture, mining, utilities, professional and technical services, manufacturing, and retail. In total, $150 billion in investment has left Canada from 2014 to 2018. And while final numbers for 2019 are not yet available, data from January to September indicates another $23 billion left in the first 9 months of last year. Well, when you're ruled by people who despise, men generally, and particularly men who work with their hands, who think that wealth comes about, by people traveling around the world to attend conferences, then ideas have consequences, and we are seeing them come to fruition. In Canada, okay, so what does the market have to say today? The Dow was up 1,049 points, or 5.2%. S&P 500 up 6%. NASDAQ up 6.3%. And the VIX, which is the Frady Cat Index, was down 8.2%. Tesla factory still open for business as Musk tells employees he'll be at work. I see this as quite controversial, that all these other businesses are being shut down, but apparently Elon Musk gets the green light. Stock futures fall after market rebounds on hopes for $1 trillion stimulus to battle coronavirus. Airlines spent $39 billion on stock buybacks. Now Democrats vow no blank check for coronavirus aid. I've been complaining about this for the longest time, that it is short-sighted and greedy behavior, and it indicates a mass distortion into the markets. But of course, it made executives and board members rich. And that's really the most important thing, isn't it? There's a piece that was reprinted, originally printed on Bloomberg by Gary Schilling, called "Globalists May Soon Become an Extinct Species." Well, I would like to think that that is true. On the other hand, after the catastrophe of 2007 to 2008, which was the result of greed, short-sightedness, actual fraud, that nothing changed. Just more of the same. Much, much more of the same. But in any event, Schilling writes, the disruptions caused by the spread of the coronavirus mean supply chains will be moved closer to home rather than in foreign lands. The coronavirus's depressing effects on the global economy and disruptions of supply chains is no doubt driving the last nail into the coffin of the globalists. They believe in the theory first articulated by Englishman David Ricardo, 1773 to 1823, that free trade among nations benefits all of them. He argued for the comparative advantage of free trade and industrial specialization. Even if one country is more competitive in every area than its trading partners, that nation should only concentrate on the areas in which it has the greatest comparative advantage. He used the example of English-produced wool being traded for French wine and not the reverse. But Ricardo's simple trade model requires economies in static equilibrium with full employment and neither trade surpluses nor deficits and similar living standards. These aren't true in the real world. Also, Ricardo didn't consider countries at different stages of economic development and different degrees of economic and political freedom, or exchange rate manipulations and competitive devaluations, since gold was universal money in his day. Ricardo also didn't factor in trading partners with huge wage differentials, such as the US and China. As a result, China can produce almost any manufactured good cheaper than America. Of course, it's not just the cost of wages, it's the cost of everything else. If you have one environmental regime, which is rather stringent, and another environmental regime, which is, shall we say, laissez-faire, then obviously it's going to be much cheaper to make things in the second example. He points out that free trade is rare. Historically, it's been largely confined to periods when a major global power promoted it in its own enlightened self-interest, such as Great Britain in the 19th century. After World War II, Americans used trade to rebuild Western Europe and Japan to counter the Soviets, and accepted the lack of reciprocity by some of these lands, notably Japan. Consequently, there were 8 global tariff-cutting rounds in the post-World War II era, from the 1947 Geneva round to the Uruguay round in 1986 to 1994. That was it. The 2001 Doha round has gone nowhere because by then Washington no longer needed to support the free world. Also, US trade deficits were chronic and growing, especially as globalization transferred manufacturing jobs to China and other low-cost Asian countries. US factory positions collapsed from 21.7 million in 1979 to 11.5 million in 2010, with only a modest recovery after the Great Recession to 12.9 million in February this year. Largely as a result of these developments, real wages for most Americans have been flat for several decades, making voters mad as hell. President Trump played to their plights and was elected by blaming weak incomes on imports and immigrants. Lack of real income growth also convinced voters in Europe that mainstream politicians weren't effective. The result was Brexit and an attraction to far-right and extreme left parties. The coronavirus's disruption of supply chains not only unhinges US imports, but also raises national security concerns. China is the world's biggest supplier of active pharmaceutical ingredients, and the Indian generic drug industry, which the FDA says supplies 40% of US generic drugs, relies on China for most of its active ingredients. Well, this efficiency, of course, is associated with a just-in-time purchasing, where no, we're going to squeeze all of the redundancy out of the system. And we apparently, we were right to squeeze all the redundancy out of the system because nothing bad or unexpected was ever going to happen again, because the experts had worked out all of the conceivable problems. Well, they did not work out all of the conceivable problems, as we can see, because we have this extraordinary situation where people are being told, do not leave your home or you will be dealt with. All throughout the West, stay home or else. That is pretty close to a catastrophe. Is it not? We have no idea how this is going to end up. We have decided to essentially, at least in the short term, destroy our economy. And I guess we can just borrow enough money. But what about all the money that's been borrowed since 2008? We're just going to throw all of these new trillions on top of it. Let's see. Polygons writes, if Republicans were smart, they aren't, they would be cutting ads right now showing people like Pelosi, AOC, Schumer, and other psychotic mouth breathers wanting open borders and cut to sick people. Brent Smith says Clinton mainly accelerated the made in China. Prior to 1992, with Clinton, it was made in Taiwan. Polygons has something nasty to say about David Frum, which I will not repeat. Lecomte de Boreas says, today no reports of new coronavirus infected in China. What did China do? We don't know what they did because China's a Potemkin village. They're saying they move faster than anyone and they have solved their problem and that we're incompetent and racist, but they would say that, wouldn't they? China is buying stocks like crazy. Shouldn't KMG be making masks? I heard he lived in an impromptu mask workshop. I couldn't comment on that. Bachelor squalor has only strengthened my immune system, says Glib Medley. And there's various suggestions for what you can use instead of a mask, and I don't think I'm going to go into that. Let's see. Yako Raipala says, I know a lot of people who travel to Russia from Finland regularly, and even when going there by train, they've tested everyone for symptoms before allowing you to get off the train. Finland and Scandinavia had it under control when it was just tourists from China who were quickly isolated and contained, but they did nothing for other travelers, so it came from Italy. The Comte Boreas says, I don't understand why Adidas factories are rolling at full capacity. Well, yeah, okay. That's a good question. We still don't have these restrictions in Canada, I guess because it would be stigmatizing. We're talking about martial law in my country, but we wouldn't want to restrict traveling, right? Because that would be stigmatizing. Kevin's window faces west. Yeah, yes, it does. No, I haven't quit broadcasting. Earl Pipe, I was gone for, what, 2 weeks? Something like that. Let's see. Glib says, woman after my yoga class, last one for the foreseeable future, was complaining about how there's all this money for banks while illegals in the restaurant biz won't be able to collect unemployment insurance. Yeah, that's quite a conundrum. No, again, as I say, you see this arrogance and the end of history. And one would have thought the arrogance would have been slapped out of these people in 2008 when, you know, the industrial world came this close to completely shutting down. No, but it reminds me of what the boss in Orson Welles' first movie. He says that, you know, he tells Orson Welles that you are going to, you know, there's a lesson. This is a lesson for you, but you strike me as the kind of man who's going to need more than one lesson. Okay, so let's go to some comments that I got here, direct messages from our friend Daniel Karbowitz. He had some very interesting things to say about what's going on now, that people are already furious or close to it, that there is going to be, you know, another bailout, which would be the third for Warren Buffett. But Warren Buffett certainly deserves it because he's just the nicest old man in the world. I mean, Warren Buffett. The funny thing about Warren Buffett, his father was a congressman, a Republican congressman from Nebraska, and he couldn't be any more unlike his son. See, Warren Buffett is one of the Warren Buffett Jr. I guess he is one of the he's one of the woke capitalists. Oh, I support all that progressivism, so you should just look the other way at everything that I do. I mean, because it's all in your best interest. The use of abusive buybacks is directly attributable to the rise of hedge funds, which demand shareholder-friendly management, which is Wall Street speak for buying back binging management. It's a dual conflict of interest conducted by executives who are paid in options on shares and short horizon thinking investor hedge funds. It's all done at the expense of passive investors who allocate blindly to these companies via 401k contributions that go into index funds. They hold the bag. I believe this is called privatizing profits and socializing losses. And then he says, and when you really fuck up like Boeing, a tit of government there to suck on. We saw it happen with Hewlett Packard, which was, one of those companies which was renowned for quality and almost universally admired. And then we see it happen to Boeing. And again, I suppose being universally admired is worth nothing compared to the amount of money that you can make if you manipulate your companies for the short term. Karbowitz continues, I think share-based compensation has to be rethought, like delaying the conversion of options into shares, and also a waiting period after executives retire or resign before shares can be sold to ensure they are aligned with the longer-term performance of the company. Tweaks like that. Well, we're all familiar with the golden handshake, the golden parachute. My favorite example was that with the head of Merrill Lynch some years ago, and he was the first member of a certain minority to hold this position, and he was not a success at his position. He was given, if I recall correctly, $155 million to go away. Greg Easterbrook, who is, I disagree with him a lot. He seems to wear rose-colored glasses about a lot of things. But I think he was perfectly right when he said that companies like HP or Merrill Lynch and many others could literally have dragged in strangers off the street who would have done a better job. We hear all the time that these companies, well, you think that they're in the, it's like when I was talking about Edward J. Epstein's book, The Hollywood Economist. You think that Hollywood is in the movie business, do you? No, Hollywood is in the hedge fund business, largely exploiting tax advantages around the world. Christopher Cole tweets, what very few realize is that the Fed's actions over the past 48 hours are primarily intended to prevent a few massive hedge funds from completely immobilizing markets as they de-risk leveraged trades. It's not about the little guy or the corner business. Oh, and China is really, really mad at the West. They've kicked out all the reporters from the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, not even allowed to operate from Hong Kong. Someone who calls himself Kaiser Sose, after the famous villain from a much overrated movie. It may seem soulless for me to write, but you can't have free markets and capitalism without failure and bankruptcy. Yeah, but it's not failure and bankruptcy if the taxpayer always makes you whole. All the airlines go chapter? Okay, fine. These assets will be bought in bankruptcy and organized into new companies and run by people who can better manage a business. That's not what happened with GM after 2008, is it? It's not what happened with AIG or Goldman Sachs, is it? The 2017 tax reform bill saved U.S. corporations a tax bill on $3 trillion in offshore balances. Most of those were repatriated, and over 70% went into stock buybacks, which raised stock prices. Now those same companies are struggling to trade debt. World's smallest violin. It's, Sir James Goldsmith was a corporate raider. He was immortalized as one of the villains in an Oliver Stone movie. He had a change of heart near the end of his life. And despite the fact that he was wont to accuse anyone who had criticized him, and that was a very long list, Despite the fact that I believe that by birth he was 1/8 Jewish, he was wont to call people anti-Semites. You're an anti-Semite. You can't criticize me without being an anti-Semite. Well, Goldsmith became big pals with Pat Buchanan, oddly enough. And Goldsmith went on the Charlie Rose show, which you can easily find on the web, where he shocked Charlie Rose and some shill from, I believe, from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, when he said that the economy exists to serve people and not the other way around. That, it's taken for granted now. That's the whole point of globalism, neoliberalism, that we exist to serve the economy. Now, we can do whatever we like to the rules around business. All of the protections, all of the perquisites that businesses claim now, that could be overturned in one legislative session. That could probably be overturned, in a week. But I don't know, the capitalists are very full of themselves. No, you can't get by without us. Well, what is it that you do now? Because, running hedge funds in the guise of actually being productive businesses is not how the system was supposed to work. But that's how it works now. And, oh, yes, the separation, social inequality between those in the middle and those at the top, it gets greater and greater. That CEOs are paid hundreds of times what the people on the shop floor are paid. But then, of course, if something bad happens to their company, well, don't blame me for it. It was market conditions. Well, if you're being paid this stupendous salary and you're being given all these very lucrative stock options, then shouldn't you be some sort of super genius? Our friend David Pinson comments, banks were all well capitalized before. This is not a banking crisis. It's a public health crisis which demands a big fiscal and monetary response. Karbowitz responded, I happen to agree that halting spending is across the board, but some businesses, specifically retail, apparel, restaurants, were zombies losing revenue way before this happened. FAANG obscured much of this under the surface, and the oil implosion was well underway too. There's another mystery to me, the assumption that the economy would bear ever more, say, places that sell coffee or restaurants. We just can't get enough of them. Really? I don't think that that's true. I don't think that that's true at all. There's a little argument going on here between Karbowitz and Pinson. Upscale malls like the ones near me were doing well before this, combining dinner and movies with high-end shops. Corona Chan is a second Great Depression due to the lockdown without aggressive fiscal and monetary action in the short term. Karbowitz responds, movie attendance has been in a decline. Asset inflation has been the driver behind consumption at upscale malls. Asset inflation has been driven by monetary and fiscal policy heretofore already. It's a feedback loop on the way up and on the way down. Perhaps no one understands how the economy works anymore. I lean towards that opinion more and more. I've long had this sort of little bit in my head where you have some fellow who's the chairman of the board of some venerable financial institution. And they don't, he's considered a fossil, right? But they're just going to let him retire in due time, for his valuable service to the company. So he happens to be looking at a quarterly report, an annual report, and the institution has done well. And then he looks at liabilities. And then he looks at the potential liabilities from the derivatives, which run into the trillions of dollars. And he drags someone into his office to say that this is obviously a misprint. No, it's not a misprint. What are you talking about? How could we possibly have liabilities into the trillions of dollars? Well, I don't really understand it all that well. But, we could get Jake in here. Okay, he went to Wharton. He can explain it to you. that, oh, derivatives, it's just, it's hedging risk. And they've always hedged risk. So it's nothing all that unusual. It's just that if several bad things happen in a row, then all of these companies will be knocked out of the box forever. They'd be gone. Goldman Sachs is an example of a company whose exposure to derivatives is absolutely shocking. So globalism, apparently it's on the way out, and the elite's been taught a lesson. Has it? Has it really? I think the lesson has been in the other direction. That somehow the shadowy elite says, this is the worst thing which has happened in the world ever. And daily life as we know it has come to an end immediately. And if you disagree, we will hurt you. There's a story from CNBC by Ari Levy, how coronavirus could finally turn universal basic income, long favored by Silicon Valley, into political reality. How about that? It's just a remarkable coincidence, isn't it? So, Hilaire Belloc, a little over 100 years ago, 1912, I believe it was, wrote a very prophetic book, which I talked about in my old podcast at length, which is called The Servile State. Very prophetic book, which, as I say, I recommend to you. But the national basic income, yeah, that is the servile state with a vengeance. Mitt Romney wants the government to cut $80,000 check for every American adult. Fellow Republican lawmaker Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas is proposing cash stipends to help people pay their bills. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said Americans need cash now, meaning in the next 2 weeks. On the other side of the aisle, Democratic Representatives Tim Ryan of Ohio and Ro Khanna of California support a payment of $1,000 to adults as part of a plan laid out by President Barack Obama's former chief economist, Jason Furman. Representative Katie Porter, another California Democrat, tweeted her support for Romney's effort on Monday. For anyone who followed Andrew Yang's performance in the Democratic primary, this idea that's now percolating in Washington sounds familiar. Well before COVID-19 became a worldwide health crisis, Yang was proposing a freedom dividend. Sounds a lot like social credit, if you've ever read about the original social credit. I mean, the Major Douglas social credit, not the Chinese social credit. A freedom dividend that would put $1,000 a month into the pockets of every American over a certain age, a reflection of the impact automation is having on the workforce. Now, I'm sure some of you remember when Andrew Yang was still running for president, when he got one of the Yang Bucks group to debase himself before the whole world by getting down on his knees and letting Andrew Yang push a button and whipped cream filled his mouth. He who pays the piper calls the tune. So if the government is going to be handing out Yang Bucks to everyone, what are they going to want in return? They are going to want something. The question is just how big is the bill going to be? And as other people have pointed out, this would be extraordinarily inflationary. And that, $1,000 isn't all that much. What can you buy with $1,000? Well, if you live frugally, if this ever comes about, the cost of all of the things involving, living frugally will vastly increase in price. From Motherboard, Amazon supply chain is breaking and small businesses are screwed. Amazon Prime is breaking. Independent sellers of Reliant services are getting locked out. The world's largest retailer announced Tuesday morning that it's suspending all shipments of non-essential products to its warehouses, a move that may help people ordering things like toilet paper and food, but will single-handedly destroy thousands of independent businesses that have come to rely on Amazon's monolithic platform. We're seeing increased online shopping, and as a result, some products such as household staples and medical supplies are out of stock. Amazon wrote in a letter to sellers who use its Fulfilled by Amazon service. With this in mind, we are temporarily prioritizing household staples, medical supplies, and other high-demand products coming into our fulfillment centers so we can more quickly receive, restock, and deliver these products to company. Yeah, one world, one company, one supply system. In retrospect, that doesn't really seem like such a good idea, does it? I mean, in retrospect, it seems like a really stupid idea, doesn't it? Because, what if something bad happens? Well, the experts are going to tell you, that no, the days of bad things happening are over, because, we have our models, and our models say everything that is going to happen in the future. But of course, again, modern life is increasingly reminding me of a Tex Avery cartoon, particularly those ones he made for MGM, where it's all about the world of the future. Where guess what? Everything goes wrong because machines run amok. Now, yeah, I was talking about Warren Buffett. And Warren Buffett is now expecting his third bailout. And there's something else about Warren Buffett that you may not know. I wrote about this at the time a few years ago, and I found it absolutely shocking that this sort of thing would be permitted. Let's see. Warren Buffett's first investment in Bank of America, this is from The Motley Fool, came in the form of preferred stock. Still reeling from the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis and the missteps of its former management, Bank of America found itself as a defendant in a hefty $10 billion lawsuit and thus found itself in need of capital. Enter Buffett, who in 2011 offered the bank $5 billion in the form of preferred stock, a type of security that's senior to the common equity but junior to a bond or note. Buffett's preferred shares yielded 6%, but even more important, they came with warrants to purchase 700,000 shares of Bank of America stock at a fixed price of $7.14 per share at any time over the following 10 years, i.e., by 2021. At the time, Buffett said of the Bank of America purchase, at Bank of America, some huge mistakes were made by prior management. And I guess the solution to those states is to give Warren Buffett the sweetheart deal of the century. In 2017, upon passing an annual Federal Reserve stress test, the bank was given more latitude to raise its dividend. Management did so, increasing its annual dividend to 48 cents per share, above the 44-cent threshold that would have equaled the 6% yield Buffett was earning on his preferred shares. Since Buffett could receive a larger annual payout from Bank of America's then current dividend than its preferred stock, Buffett swapped his preferred stock for 700 million common shares. Yeah, they call it doing well by doing good, and I suppose no one is the master of that more than Warren Buffett. There was a particular tweet that I saw about this, and I suppose this appealed to me because I had written something similar about a decade ago, that that Warren Buffett is he's out there in his rocker on the porch, middle America, sipping cherry Coke. He likes ice cream. He's just a regular guy. Well, he's not a regular guy. He is not a regular guy, even close. He is, as many people have pointed out, a shark. And despite the fact that he is he's older. He's older than Biden and Bernie Sanders. He just can't stop accumulating money. I don't know. Andrew Carnegie thought that it was the duty of people like himself to spend half their life making money and the other half giving it away. Well, I suppose people like Andrew Carnegie, Warren Buffett would see someone like Andrew Carnegie as a fool. Because, I mean, what's the point of being alive if you are not constantly getting richer and richer and richer and richer in such a way that barely seems understandable. Now, Matt Stoller has an interesting piece on Substack, How to Structure the Coronavirus Bailout. And I suppose it would be useful, before talking about what should be done, to mention what has been done and why that should not have done. He asks himself the question, is a coronavirus bailout necessary? And he responds, yes. I'm in favor of bailing out the corporate sector, just as I think it's critical to make sure that small businesses are made whole for something that is beyond any of our control. I don't know that that statement is actually true, because the measures that have been taken with regard to the coronavirus are very much within our control. But we'll leave that aside for now. But the bailout cannot and should not simply flow into the sticky hands of financiers so they can buy more private jets after the crisis has passed. Right now, the American corporate apparatus is designed as a sort of pass-through entity for financiers. For instance, Toys R Us became a mechanism for a private equity company to grab cash, and only incidentally a toy retailer. Any bailouts, particularly to large businesses, must be conditioned to stop these kinds of transfers. It's unlikely most corporations could handle a shock like what they are experiencing, but our big businesses are particularly unsuited to do so now. For the last 40 years, Wall Street thinned out the ability of our corporations to handle risk by loading them up with debt and encouraging mergers and offshoring. Yes, that's what they call too big to fail. American corporations used to have little debt, as well as localized production facilities and responsible executives who understood production. It was a resilient system, able to hang swings in the economy. That is no longer the case. Since William Simon and Michael Milken in the 1980s organized junk bond-fueled takeovers, American finance has been organized around smashing our industrial systems for cash and injecting hidden risk into American society. The lack of capacity to make our own medicine or masks is precisely a result of this hidden risk. As I wrote last July, the goal is to eliminate production in favor of scalable, profitable things like brands, patents, and tax loopholes, because producers, engineers, artists, workers are cost centers. Production can also be eliminated by fissuring the workplace, such as the mass move to offshore production to lower cost countries in the 1980s onward. When I reported on the problem of financialization destroying our national security capacity, one of the manufacturers I talked to told me about how the LBO boys, or leverage buyout boys, took apart factories in the Midwest and shipped them to China. When the Soviet Union did that to German factories after the end of World War II, it was seen as rather shocking. But I guess if it's in the aid of capitalism and not communism, then that makes it all right. Matt Stoller continues, American corporations are run not to make things, but to enable financiers and CEOs to grab cash and hide risk. They do this through 4 different techniques. They use stock buybacks and dividend payouts, which means they use the corporation's cash and credit lines to transfer money to shareholders. Mergers and acquisitions to structure monopolies and/or fees for investment banks, payoffs for layoffs. Excessive executive compensation, and last, lobbying and public relations to organize political control. I will note, with regard to that last point, that you may have seen, it's worse in my country than in yours, and by yours in the United States, in that if you look at our political commentators, they are largely dominated by what Simon Heffer described as PR spiffs. The public relations industry, the lobbying industry, was fairly notorious until quite recently. But now we're all supposed to admire people who lie for a living. That, yeah, we just hire enough people, the really, really bright people, and we hide them away from government if necessary, so that we get to do whatever we want, and anything that goes wrong is not our fault, and it is the duty of the taxpayer to make us whole. Imagine that you have the ability to make outrageous bets on things, on financial questions. And if the bets pay off, then you become fabulously rich. If the bets go south, you don't lose any money because the government makes you whole. Because ever since, 1994, with the Mexican bailout of 1994, there was a principle established, which is that Wall Street cannot be allowed to lose money. That's not how the system works. The way the system works is that Wall Street always makes money. But shouldn't they be punished for bad decisions? No, they should not be punished for bad decisions because that would impugn confidence in our institutions and in capitalism itself. And we cannot have that. A financialization of private equity is about loading up corporations with hidden risk, Stoller writes. We cannot afford that anymore. So here are the conditions to put on large corporations who need cash from the government. No bailouts for shareholders. Shareholders took the risk and upside, they should get the downside too. A bailout means the stock value goes to zero. No more buybacks ever and no more dividends for 5 years. It's time to stop asset stripping and restore the cushion inside corporations so they can invest in production. Strict executive compensation limits. No more get-rich-quick schemes and golden parachutes. We need long-term leaders focused on building institutional strength. No more lobbying, as well as limit public relations spending. The Housing and Economic Recovery Act of 2008 killed the ability of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to lobby, and that killed their political power. By contrast, Wall Street got bailouts with no strings attached, so they largely wrote the Dodd-Frank bill. I was there, I saw it. Don't repeat this. No more mergers and acquisitions for 5 years. If you get bailouts, you have to run your business as a business, not as an acquisition target. I can imagine an exception if the business fails as a standalone, but exceptions need to be very narrow. Now, I imagine that there are some people listening to my diatribe here and saying that Kevin in his old age has become a Bolshevik. No, I think that I've become a moderate because I agree almost entirely with what Stoller says. That, oh, but more free enterprise. Well, the old free enterprise had rules. Again, you took risks. If you made stupid risks, you took losses. You just had to eat the losses. The system was not supposed to socialize loss and privatize profits. That's the system we have now. And I would suggest that if reforms of the like of which Stoller is propounding are not adopted, something much worse could be in store for the capitalists. Last week, Steve Mnuchin said that the current stock market crash is a great opportunity for investors, and at a certain point, it will be. That doesn't change when it is public authorities as the only ones with capital to deploy. It just becomes a question of how those public authorities will use their money printing and fiscal authority to structure our corporations. In 2008, 2009, President Bush and Obama had massive leverage and used that leverage to make sure the corporate state remained under the thumb of financiers. After the crisis, private equity boomed yet again, and executive compensation, lobbying, buybacks, and mergers exploded. If you've ever studied what the free market is supposed to look like, you read textbooks, economic textbooks, you're told that the advantage of the free market over socialism or communism is that socialism and communism cannot determine prices. Well, we can't determine prices either. Because, used to hear about price to earning ratios among stocks. Well, that got thrown out the window. If the government can create an infinite amount of money, then what is money worth anymore? We don't really have any idea of knowing, do we? So let's see how the US dollar is doing. Let's take $1 US, and we will compare it to my Canadian dollar. Here we go. Come on. Oh, wow. It's up to $1.42 plus. Ay, 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 ay. That is bad. That is really, really bad. Of course, manufacturers will say this is necessary. But on the other hand, an enormous amount of what Canadians buy comes from the United States. So this is, heavily deflationary in a very real and not just in an abstract way. So let me go to the chat here and catch up. See what people have been saying. China drove tanks over their citizens. Today, China issued a joint statement with Pakistan condemning India over Kashmir. This right after India gave China medical aid. Tiananmen Square, look, I think it's far more complicated than the media, the Western media, reported at the time. The demonstrators would not have been allowed to have been there for all of those days in public like that without support from a significant faction of the Communist Party, because it's not as if there's anything resembling public opinion expressed politically in the People's Republic of China. The lipped one says fun is so 2019. Brandon Smith says it's a police state of mind. I really do feel that way, you know, that if I'm out on the street, which is quite rare now, and if I feel the need to cough, you know, I normally would cough, I don't know, once an hour, once every 2 hours, just scratchy throat, something like that. I find myself holding it in desperately. Don't want to be caught coughing in public. You might get, you know, I might get led away. Just in case anyone's interested, I am not ill, not in the slightest. I am in good shape medically. Feel good. I mean, come on, you can hear me. You can hear me talk. I sound pretty healthy, I think. Okay. Is KMG drinking his sherry on camera a new thing? I believe I did it on my birthday, and I may have done it on Christmas Day. But it, as I say, it is the feast day, the patron saint of my people, so it's a special occasion. Special occasion, like Jin Yang used to say in Silicon Valley. For a real special occasion, I suppose I'd be smoking, but that is sadly not possible. The Trap, a good book by Goldsmith. It is a good book by Goldsmith. It's a shame that he was taken from us as quickly as he was, although I remember that this is the fellow, Sir James Goldsmith, who tried to get Richard Ingrams and Oberyn Waugh and Patrick Marnham and a bunch of other journalists. He wanted them thrown into prison for criminal libel. He was a dangerous man, no question about it. Can you point towards a good sherry? Well, it should come from Spain. You know, what is this stuff here? Is this made by Harvey's? Harvey's is a good company. I also like, you may have seen me before, Tio Pepe, which I quite like. But no, it should be dry. I suppose Bristol Cream is a bit sweeter. But you know, that's the divide with sherry. Is there's the stuff which is somewhat austere, and then there's the stuff that old ladies and winos drink. Did Kevin cover the Biden-Sanders debate yesterday? I did talk about it. I mean, there's nothing much going on there. Is there? I've been just struck again and again by how weak Sanders is. That I know that his supporters, or a great many of the so-called Bernie bros, are absolutely livid, that they think that their boy has been stopped from winning the nomination second go-around in a row. But he just doesn't have the fire in the belly, you know, as they used to say. I mean, I'm not saying that I want him to be flailing, but I mean, when people come up onto your stage and grab your microphones and, you know, you just stand there looking weak, well, then I guess you are weak. Earl Pipe says, have you been making any arrangements with Freak or TOG in case the road war actually happens soon? Those guys love you. They'll let you have a leadership position. Yeah, I don't know. It's rather beyond the realm of possibility for me, at least how I see it. You see, I mean, these things happen, and then you're in a completely new situation. If someone had told me a month ago that I would be terrified to walk out into the sidewalk or to walk into a grocery store because I thought some, officious person might report me to the police, I would have said, no, that's crazy. That would never happen. But that's where we are, I often wondered about this, if it comes down to the road war. I mean, what would I be good at? And I'm thinking, I think I might have some talent as a demagogue. Okay? I think I might have some talent as a demagogue. But I'm reminded of this conversation on 30 Rock between Jack and Liz, where Jack said to her, what purpose would you serve in a post-apocalyptic society? And Liz said, traveling bard. And quick as a flash, Jack said, radiation canary. I'll just repeat, it is a dry sack. That's the name of it. And it is a sherry from Jerez de la Frontera. Isn't that where this stuff comes from? I just love saying that, the Castilian accent. Okay. We'll just vote for big government, says Isaiah Selassie, and then get outraged and angry when it turns out humans are not saints. The Constitutionalists, like to quote Madison on this, but America's not the same country, obviously, now that it was in 1789, and there have been changes in demographics, but there has been a move towards democracy, and America was not founded as a democracy. It was founded as as representative government. And this has had innumerable consequences, as well as the enormous rise of scale, right? That if you look at American society in 1789, well, the South was a planter society, and the North was more industrialized, but it was all on a very small scale. And, where does the power come from? From rivers, from creeks, that sort of thing now? I mean, talking about road war, I think that California is in a position now where things could go south in a big way all at once, because there doesn't seem to be any trust there whatsoever. That how could you have trust in a society where, oh yeah, you get to steal up to, what is it, $875 now, and we're not going to arrest you? It's an open invitation to theft. Or you're going to have people urinating and defecating and shooting up on the street, and we're not going to do anything about that because that would be cruel. And then people say, I'm kind of in an entry position here in Silicon Valley, and I have to take that stupid bus to work every day and back. And I'm paying $6,000 for my apartment, which is not all that great. And then I go out to the streets, and there's this. I mean, why would you expect any loyalty, under conditions like that? You see what's happening in New York State now, that people are saying that, we're just going to stop arresting people. Wow, that's going to bring on the road war really fast. Let's just stop arresting people, for these minor crimes. Well, to a shopkeeper, when you go into a shop and you steal $500 worth of his stuff, that is not a minor crime to him. Have a sip for my mother if you can, says Earl Putt. I will do so. Philadelphia police ordered to suspend making arrests. Josh Randall says smoking meth while piloting an airliner is only an infraction now. If you want a welfare state, do it at the state level where the scale is like Scandinavia. Yeah, well, that worked very well in Scandinavia, I suppose. It doesn't sound like a very... I mentioned Huntford's book, The New Totalitarians, in that regard. It seemed rather grim to me. But then, of course, they decided that they were sick of Swedes being around Swedes, so we're going to import all of these people who do not believe in our rules, who think that it's stupid. That our rules are stupid. They're for suckers. Again, Germany is very similar. I remember reading some years ago, I think it could have been in the London Spectator, that someone said that he got caught being on a train without the proper ticket. And he thought, well, okay, I'll have to pay a fine. To his astonishment, he was asked quite sincerely whether he would like free psychological counseling. Because I guess evidently the German idea was, what sort of person would not pay for his train ticket? Again, you hear about these Scandinavian schemes to do with heroin addicts. Well, the heroin addicts in Scandinavia are not like the heroin addicts here. In Germany, they don't need to, or maybe they do now, but in the past, they didn't need to put up signs saying, the German equivalent of "don't walk on the grass," because they wouldn't have thought of walking on the grass. I mean, what sort of a person would do that? There's the path. You don't leave the path. But, here in our Anglo-American societies, we are far more anarchic than in Scandinavia and in Germany. And that's one of the reasons why the welfare states have been far more troublesome in, say, Great Britain, Canada, the United States, and Australia. I came across a piece in the UN's review by Philip Giraldi, who I mentioned earlier in the show. He's a big fan of the Palestinians and their intifada. I am not. But he reports on the fact that America still has a Nazi hunter office. Now, I'm constantly having to do this arithmetic in my head, and I'm thinking it doesn't get any less ridiculous every time that I do it. That, okay, so 1945, that's when World War II ended, to 2000, that's 55 years, 20 plus 55 is 75 years. That is 4 generations, pretty much. How old are these Nazis, by the way? And what constitutes being a Nazi? Philip Giraldi reports on Eli Rosenbaum, the Justice Department's chief Nazi hunter. This is a fairly large department in the U.S. federal government. And he is talking, he writes about a fellow called a 94-year-old man living in Tennessee named Friedrich Karl Berger, who was recently ordered by Memphis federal judge Rebecca Holt to be returned to Germany. Holt ruled that he was deportable under the 1978 Holtzman, that's for Elizabeth Holtzman, a very significant figure in this field, the Holtz Amendment to the Immigration and Nationality Act, due to his willing service as an armed guard of prisoners at a concentration camp where persecution took place, which constituted rendering voluntary assistance to a Nazi-sponsored persecution. Some facts regarding Berger's involvement in World War II were presented by his defense and do not seem to have been disputed by the prosecution, represented by Rosenbaum, who regretted that the passage of 75 years since 1945 means that Berger might be the last real live Nazi he is able to punish. Berger was drafted in 1943 when he was 17 years old at the height of the war and was enlisted in the Navy. In 1945, he was seconded to the Neuengamme prison camp near Hamburg as a guard. Neuengamme was in fact a complex of as many as 80 camps and subcamps that were relatively low security. Berger was at a subcamp near Meppen. Jews, Poles, Russians, Danes, Dutch, Latvians, French, Italians, and political opponents of the Nazis were imprisoned in the camp. And it is believed that some of the prisoners, mostly Russians, were the victims of medical experiments or were gassed to death. Many prisoners also reportedly died from malnutrition and abuse, as well as from actual starvation when the Allies began to bomb the railroads and roads that provided food to the camps. Okay, so here we have a young man, quite young man, 17 years old. He is drafted at a desperate time by the German government, and the argument by the American government was that this fellow Berger simply should have said, to his commanding officers, "I'm sorry, I do not care to fulfill the duties that you have ordered me to fulfill." That we're seriously supposed to believe that someone like Rosenbaum here, he doesn't know what the cost of that would have been, which is a bullet to the back of the head. Oh, yes, but we should expect people, to be strong in this regard. We are seriously making this argument on the basis of 13 people who have been found to have a disease on the 8th largest island in the world where I live. We've been ordered that we're not allowed to go outside anymore. Well, we can still go outside for how long? We don't know. But the schools have been shut, the universities have been shut, all of these things, the libraries have been shut, community centers have been shut. And the authorities say, this is the gravest threat that has ever presented itself to the province of British Columbia. And there are 13 people who have this disease, and this is the gravest threat. Really? So I don't want to hear another word from anyone about the cowardice of people facing retribution in World War II, because we are far more cowardly than they were. Far more cowardly. It is absolutely shameful. But again, when you're dealing with 94-year-olds, and okay, he was a guard at the camp. Was he ever involved in any cruelty? Well, we don't have to prove that. What do you have to prove? That he was a guard at the camp. Oh, he's a guard at the camp. Oh, really? Okay, well, that seems to be very, very broad there, because, and maybe something you might be a little worried about, because there's all sorts of atrocities that are committed in wartime situations, as I've noted previously on this live stream. Lieutenant General Michael Short of the U.S. Air Force admitted during 1999 that NATO, mostly planes from the United States, Britain, and Canada 10%, were engaged in the terror bombing of civilians in Yugoslavia. That is a war crime as defined by the Nuremberg Protocols. So are Bill Clinton and Tony Blair and Jean Chrétien, as well as Lieutenant General Short, they're going to be hauled off to The Hague? Well, it seems laughable now, but things could change. Things could change, but of course, we're running out of Nazis, or just scared kids who are press ganged into jobs. And what's going to happen then? Well, I first said this is a joke about 15 years ago, but now I am not so sure that it actually is a joke, which is that they are going to prosecute the dead. Well, we'll see if it happens. I mean, seriously, I wouldn't be surprised. So I've been watching Better Call Saul, which is the prequel, both the prequel and successor to Breaking Bad. It's very well done. I mean, the writing and photography and acting is all top notch. And I suppose we've reached the part in the show where, okay, so how did Saul Goodman, as he calls himself now, Jimmy McGill, as he used to be, how does he become the criminal lawyer, as Jesse Pinkman called him, that we all knew and loved from Breaking Bad? Well, he is in a relationship with another lawyer named Kim. Kim is she's quite a bright person, brighter than Saul, I think you would have to say. But, I've been watching the last couple of episodes, and I'm beginning to dislike Kim because she's a hotshot lawyer, but she carries around this chip on her shoulder. Oh, that her law school tuition had been paid for by her former firm because she worked for them. She really doesn't seem to like practicing law. Now, actually, I was involved with the law profession on a minor level. Some years ago, I was a law clerk for one of Canada's best known lawyers, a civil rights lawyer, a sole practitioner, just like Saul Goodman. And I'll tell you something, that bit in the story, it's rubbish. You don't have an office full of people, coming up to you. Will you take my case? Will you take my case? If you're a sole practitioner, there's not very many cases that you can take for, obvious reasons. It was always a gag, a good gag. The storefront office that Saul Goodman had, and all of the wrecked and low rent people that were in his waiting room. But no, it's far too many people. So Kim, she wants to do her pro bono legal work, and I just, I'm going to complain a bit about this show, in that a certain sentimentality there. You're really dealing with scum, okay? You're dealing with inveterate liars and criminals and people who are looking to double cross you, okay? But, apparently, with Kim, she has managed the clients that she gets. It's like they're all out of a stage production of Les Miserables. They're wretched of the earth. She's been treated very well by this company, Mesa Verde, that she works for. In fact, they literally let her write her own ticket, But some old man, Barry Corbin, the actor, a well-known actor, quite good, he was being evicted for a Mesa Verde call center because it turned out that, well, he did not own, he owned his house, he did not own the land on which the house was built. Now, this wasn't a secret to him. I guess the assumption was that he had been in the house for 30 years and that it's in the desert, right? A long way from anywhere, and that no one was ever going to want this land. Well, one day, a company which had the legal right to it decided that they were going to evict him. And so Mesa Verde made him, a pretty good offer. And then Kim, out of the goodness of her heart, decides that, look, I know you're an old man and you've been here for so long. I am personally going to help you find a new place. Here's a bunch of houses, et cetera, et cetera. And so the old man is just, he's just truculent. That's what he's going to be. And he's not going to win this. You're not going to win this because the guy from Mesa Verde, Kevin, decides that, nah, I'm just not going to let these people run over me. And Rich Schweikert was the woman who brought Kim in to his law firm with Mesa Verde. He's twigged on to the fact that she's cheating him, that she is working against the interests of the firm, despite the generosity of the firm to her. And Kim has this calculated breakdown in the foyer of the office in front of all the other people who work there. This little stunt. What are you calling me a liar? What are you accusing me of? It's absolutely shameful behavior on her part. At the same time that Jimmy, aka Saul, was saying, look, we gave it our best shot, okay? We had a lot of fun with all the fraud we employed, but if they're going to play hardball, they're going to win. So, come on. The old man knew what the deal was. I mean, a sad situation, but it's time for you to step back. But no, she's not going to do it. And she is as truculent as Kevin is, but not in a good cause. In the same way that that Mike Ehrmantraut, I never liked this guy. Never liked this guy at all. His relentless cynicism is just absolutely wearying. This is a guy who got himself shot to death because he just couldn't keep his mouth shut. He's the one who told Walter White, just because you rob a train doesn't make you Jesse James. Well, yes, it does make you Jesse James. And we're supposed to believe that he has this romantic notion, about gangsters and about how, not all the police are good, not all the criminals are bad. And this is, like something out of a French a gangster film, like a Jean-Pierre Melville. I mean, I love Jean-Pierre Melville. I've talked about him on Theater Thursday, but it's a convention. It doesn't exist in real life. So this guy decides, that he is going to get shit-faced drunk, and then he's going to walk home deliberately, exposing himself to the greatest possible danger. Not that he would take a cab or anything sensible like that, even though he can well afford it. No, he's looking for a fight, and the first time he manages to break the arm of one of the gangsters. First time around, it was amusingly one of those racially integrated gangs. The second time around, it wasn't. The second time around, he gets savagely beaten and stabbed in the gut. And he wakes up and he's in Adobe land, very obviously Mexico, and he's pissed off, and he figures out that, Gus Fring has saved his life by getting his on-call doctor to, do surgery on him. And this guy, he's just so resentful of everything, and I don't, you just see him scowling for anywhere from, 5 to 20 minutes an episode. And I really don't think that he's that worthwhile a character to invest all that much time in. I mean, he was a crooked cop who decided to become essentially a hired thug. And we're supposed to believe that he's going through these agonies, these ethical agonies. I'll tell you a secret about life, okay? People don't go through ethical agonies, okay? There's an ethos that is attached to pretty much every institution. And when you enter it, perhaps to your surprise, perhaps to your distaste or displeasure, you learn what the ethos is. And you decide that you are going to bend to the ethos, or the ethos will break you. It's that simple. The people who work in an occupation where the ethos is offensive to them, well, one of three things happens. They get quit, or they get fired, or they go crazy, okay? Because people over the long term cannot consistently do things that they disagree with, particularly if it's their job. That's why I can't bear watching shows about lawyers generally. I mean, shows like LA Law, say, or shows about doctors. Come on. The medical profession has had no problem at all, with very few exceptions, with, so we have a 6-year-old here who's a boy, but apparently he's a girl. So we're going to give him, hormone blockers, because that, the Hippocrates, would have said, yeah, absolutely do that. I mean, did they fight against that at all? It seems like to me that they folded immediately. It's all, harm-based morality. Oh no, people are going to start moaning and crying, and we can't have that. So, our ethos will just go out the window. I see Earl Pipe says, yeah, Mike annoyed me too. The more backstory he gets, the less sense he makes as a character. I just, Mike, he seems to combine this low self-esteem with a kind of hatred or disdain for everyone else. I mean, obviously, Walter White was in many ways an obnoxious person, but you look at the stuff that he pulled off, come on, you got to be admiring of some of that, right? Because Mike is simply a by-the-book, small-time operator, And, okay, and this business with his son, also a cop who was killed, where he gets nuts and starts screaming at his, what is it, his daughter-in-law, his niece, who is, she's what, 6, 7 years old? Oh, she kept asking questions about his dead son. This is a child you're dealing with, And given how scary Mike Ehrmantraut is, I mean, this is a guy, if you met him in real life, you would probably flinch, right? And he's going to act like this with a child? Okay, we're heading into the home stretch here. I saw a piece from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency talking about Donald Trump as a great friend to the Jews, which I think is true. But the problem is that the Jews in the media, they don't like him, and they're never going to like him. It's that simple. I mean, there are exceptions, but overwhelmingly, I don't know. They're thinking on a completely different level. They got other things going on. There was a more interesting story from Haaretz that apparently Jews, again, I suppose we're talking about media Jews or elite Jews, they don't seem to like Bernie Sanders very much, and they're not very thrilled by the prospect of Sanders becoming the first Jewish president. Why would that be? Well, it's explained here. And I'll have to credit the writer here, Eitan Netchin. Okay. Now, this is really fascinating to me, you know. Sanders' unique position illuminated a fact that hadn't been talked about directly, but instead became sublimated into the mainstream political discourse. In America of 2020, Jews are seen as white until they challenge the white establishment. Today, most Jews are seen as white. Many Jews also see themselves as white. It's my understanding the vast majority of them do. For many liberals, and just in case anyone's interested, there's never been any doubt in my mind that Jews are white for what it's worth. For many liberals who are seeking a diversity candidate, Sanders is seen as an old white guy. Boo! This is due to the fact that American Jews have experienced a level of success in integration in ways that still eludes other minorities, especially people of color. Oh dear. In U.S. society, where color is a major factor in predicting income and treatment by law enforcement, that just makes me laugh. That just makes me laugh. Yeah, see, they're picking on the homeboys, whereas you know, all the Jewish gangsters, the cops leave them alone. You know, they're plugging all these people on the street, but the cops, no, we're going to touch you. Anyway, in U.S. society, where color is a major factor in predicting income and treatment by law enforcement, Jewishness, the representation of Jewish cultural experience in the public sphere, as opposed to Judaism, a religious practice, could be absorbed into the white mainstream population. Yet in many instances, Jewishness was and could never be seen as white, whether racially or culturally. Visibly Jewish Americans, especially the ultra-Orthodox communities whose members often was and could never be seen as white, whether racially or culturally. Visibly Jewish Americans, especially the ultra-Orthodox communities whose members often mainstream media, ever consider that, are always perceived as Jews first. Well, if there's a guy and he looks like most other guys, then you're going to think that he's a member of your club, right? Isn't that how that works? However, Mizrahi Jews, those descendants of Jews coming from the Arab and Muslim world, and Black Jews, I'll hold my tongue here, as well as members of many communities from the former Soviet Union, never passed as white, neither in society at large nor among other Jews. What? That makes for roughly 40% of the American Jewish population who are conspicuously different from the white American experience. And apparently, I don't know, Bernie Sanders has to pay for all this nonsense. Liberals like to disguise their anti-Jewish sentiment as a critique of white maleness. For example, Joy Reid, an MSNBC contributor, brought a body language expert into the studio to say Sanders was lying when he denied telling Elizabeth Warren he didn't think a woman could be elected. There's a physicality to the way he talks, shaking your fingers at Hillary Clinton. Weird, Reid said. You know, Joy Ann Reid, who is a dumb person, she has her own show on MSNBC. But I guess Bernie Sanders would never, be mean to Joy Ann Reid. Because, well, why not? Why not? Bernie Sanders has played this nice guy routine, and where has it gotten him? He played the nice guy routine with Elizabeth Warren. I do not believe for a second that Bernie Sanders told Elizabeth warned that a woman can never be elected president of the United States, he was clearly referring to Hillary Clinton. And it turned out that he was right. But you see, he's not willing to make his own case. And when you have a man who's not willing to fight his own corner, then why should the rest of us care about him? And I've been following Bernie Sanders' career for decades, and it becomes less interesting the older he gets, because he has been trapped by intersectionality. He was a pretty straightforward, old school leftist, going back to the 1980s, who had some interesting things to say about immigration, American workers, American business, and such like. But now he has to wonder about how he's going to make up for the sin of being a white guy. It's very sad in a way. So a happy St. Patrick's Day again to you all. I'm going to take my leave of you. I'll take one last look at the chat here. People talking about restaurant stores in Manhattan. Empty shelves in Soviet-occupied Estonia in 1989. It's funny because it seems romantic now. I remember this Muriel Spark novel, or not a novel, a short story, Bang Bang, You're Dead, it's called. Muriel Spark spent several years living in what was called Rhodesia in the 1940s. And amongst the British settlers, it was a very close-knit society, claustrophobic, one might say. There were not very many of them. And so we have this young British girl, and she is reading these outdated magazines. They're like 4 to 6 months old by the time that they get to Rhodesia. And it's all about the shortages of the post-war period. Anthony Burgess once remembered that he saw the beginning of a novel or a short story that began, it was the 100th day of the razor blade. So anyway, you have this woman in the colonies, and she thinks this is so romantic. And that really spoke to me, because I remember reading Dostoevsky when I was a young man, and he's writing about these squalid taverns and these salons privés in St. Petersburg, and my reaction was, oh, how romantic. Anyway, Aaron Gobra, indeed. So I will be back on the air tomorrow, Wednesday, the 18th, at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. It's James Bond week on the show. On Theater Thursday, we are talking on March the 19th about my favorite James Bond film, controversial choice, I understand, on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And the following day, March 20th, Friday, we are going to be discussing Kingsley Amos's excellent survey of the work of Ian Fleming, which is called The James Bond Dossier. If you appreciated the show or any part of it, I would appreciate you clicking on like or subscribing to my YouTube channel. If you were looking to support the show with a donation, my PayPal account is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that you have a wonderful evening. Good night.